All right. Hello, everyone. Can you all see and hear me without any issue? Excellent. Right. So today, what we're going to do is try and finish off the unit on perception. Firstly, just a quick update. That is the TAs and I, are very nearly finished marking quiz number one. So we're almost done. There are just like a couple little things to do, couple, little administrative things, cross the T's, dot the I's sort of thing. But once that's done, I can share all of your feedback with you. And I should be able to do that this evening once I'm back from campus. So I don't have an exact time in mind, but it'll be sometime in the evening. And just a reminder, like if you have questions about your grade or about any of the feedback comments, you'll want to contact the person who marked it. In some cases, that's me. Um, but in some cases, it'll be the teaching assistants, and their name will be there. uh, on the multiple choice and true false answers are graded automatically, but the short answer questions are graded by us, and it will say who marked it. And then you can go and take a look at the updated course outline that I've provided, find the contact information, ask whichever TA marked your work, just in case you have any questions. Questions here is like, clarification, feedback. It's not mark grubbing, right? So don't, we won't really deal with, you know, sorts of things like, where a student feels they deserve a better mark. That's not really the student's call, right? So if you have questions or anything like that, that's fine. But we generally don't do mark grubbing. Okay, so on to perception. Last time we talked about naive realism as a subtype of direct realism. We talked about certain kinds of representative realism. So these are like representative realism is a subtype of indirect realism. And we talked briefly about sense data, to kind of illustrate the notion of um, representative realism. And then we talked about John Locke's theory, which is like a causal representative sort of realism, where things exist mind independently. These things, not only are they mind independent, but they're publicly accessible, and the mind represents them. We don't directly perceive these objects. What we perceive is really our mind's own representation of these objects. Um, this is kind of where we left off, right? And this quote is in the previous bunch of slides, but this is from Locke, who said, "It is evident that the mind knows not things immediately, but only by the intervention of the ideas it has of them." So again, a sort of indirectness, um, by virtue of the fact that we don't know the objects themselves, but rather representations of them. That's what Locke means when he says ideas, mental representations. Our knowledge, therefore, is real, he continues, only so far as there is conformity between our ideas and the reality of things. But what shall be here the criterion? How shall the mind, when it perceives nothing but its own ideas, know they agree with the things themselves? So there's a sort of skeptical challenge that we can offer against Locke, right? How do we really know? He's asking here. How do we really know that our perceptions match reality if they are indirect? If what we perceive, like what I'm experiencing now, is a mental representation, how do I know that it matches reality when my mind can only directly perceive these ideas and not the things themselves, right? And further, what justifies the distinction that we've made last time between primary and secondary qualities and the ideas thereof, right? Why should we say that, um, sure, my ideas of primary qualities resemble the qualities of the object, but my ideas of secondary qualities don't? I mean, what's up with that? What justifies that claim? And really, do either of these qualities, or rather our ideas of them, give us accurate knowledge about what they're supposed to represent? We can't really know, the skeptic would say, if perception is indirect in this way. Now, Locke thought that he could address some of these problems, right? One thing to note here, which Locke did, is that these ideas are contravolitional. So it's like they happen to us. We don't cause them ourselves, but they're caused by something outside of us. And remember, this was a critical point in Descartes' dream argument too, right? The whole point of the dream argument was that during dreams, the ideas, the mental representations we have, aren't caused by something outside of us, but something internal to us. And because we can't reliably tell whether we're dreaming or awake, we have to question whether our sensory experiences are really caused by anything out there in the world. Um, same same thing, same idea here, only okay, this is Locke's reply, like, okay, here's how we can maybe be reasonably certain that um, that we can know what things are like, because they're caused by things outside of us. They're not caused by our own minds, but caused maybe by the objects of perception, right? The light shining off of this coffee cup is what ultimately is at the start of that causal chain, where at the end I end up with a mental representation of the coffee cup. Right? So the ideas are contravolitional and they seem to be caused by properties of objects that are out there in the world. But there are problems that remain. For example, we don't experience the causes directly, only indirectly, only the ideas. So, how can we justify this claim that we're actually indirectly perceiving objects in the world, like non-philosophically? Can science help? Maybe. Maybe, as I say here on slide 2, the existence of objects in the world is justified by some kind of inference from sensations, but also the theoretical framework we employ that explains those sensation. And that's what I mean by science. That's what Crumley means by science. Is not necessarily, whatever's taking place in a lab, but by science, what we mean is there's a sort of theoretical framework that we can have that explains all of these observations we've made. You know, like I can say like, okay, look, I'm a representative realist, and that means that I only know the representations directly, not what's out there in the world. So how do you really know that? Um, how do you really know that your perceptions accurately represent what's out there in the world? Well, Locke might say they're contravolitional and they're probably caused by what's out there in the world. Um, how do we know that? Well, we don't know the causes directly, but we have a nice theoretical framework that's nice and straightforward, nice and parsimonious, that seems to make sense of it. Um, After all, in the sciences, there are lots of things that we cannot directly observe, but which we infer the existence of on the basis of some observations that we've made and some theory that we've come up with to explain those observations. So, can you think of any such things that we've inferred the existence of rather than directly observed in the sciences? Well, gravitons might not exist. It's a kind of still an open question, isn't it? Electrons? Yeah, I'm not sure if we've directly observed electrons myself, actually. But radiation, I don't really know what metaphase is. Black holes, sure, yeah, that's a great example. That's exactly the sort of thing that I'm looking for because we can't see them, can we? Why not? Well, because light cannot escape the gravity of a black hole. So what do? You infer its existence by looking at the behavior of other things around. So um, stars that appear to orbit nothing. It's a pretty good sign you got a black hole there. You might see, those sort of jets of X-rays and stuff that come out of the poles, but yeah, some principles in quantum mechanics. Uh, maybe another good example would be dark matter, dark energy, right? We infer its existence based on what we observe, but we don't directly observe it. That's why we call it dark. So those are the sort of things we mean. Maybe in a similar way, we can infer the existence of objects using some kind of scientific theoretical framework. What do you think? Is that good enough for you, or do you want a more direct form of realism? Let's get some discussion going. I mean, speaking for myself, I'm kind of satisfied with something like this. I think whether you go with, some sort of representative realism or, there's a similar claim going on in Kant's transcendental idealism, where we never really know the things themselves directly. We only know things as they're sort of presented to us or how they're structured by the mind. The structure of the mind for Kant gives us a sort of certainty about things, whereas for representative realism, it's the scientific sort of theoretical support which lends it that structure. But either way, we don't really know things themselves, or the things in themselves, as Kant would say. Yeah. So maybe Locke, like Sean was saying, maybe Locke hasn't got it completely figured out, but it seems like some kind of indirect realism is what's happening, right? Sure, we could still be a brain in a vat, but then I don't know. That's when, for me at least, the principle of parsimony kicks in, right? What is the best explanation? Usually the simpler explanation. And the simpler explanation is just that there is a world that I'm in and that I can perceive indirectly, rather than I'm being kept in a vat, or that my brain is being kept in a vat, right? Principle of parsimony, which we'll talk about more actually when we talk about universals next time. But then there's a radically different alternative to both of the forms of realism that we've looked at. Yeah. Yeah, like there are regularities not just in my experiences, but regularities between your experience and my experience. Right? Like if I gave you a map of the campus with an X marked on it where I am right now, you could find that place and I might be here, and that kind of that makes sense if we're all inhabiting um the same reality, right? With objects that are mind independent and publicly accessible. Um, okay, so there's an alternative, as I was saying, to these sorts of realist theories, right? What's the appeal of this alternative? Well, naive realism doesn't really seem to work. Maybe some kind of direct realism does, but straight up naive realism cannot be how it works. And there are skeptical challenges against representative realism. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is something that we call phenomenalism. So, phenomenalism comes from phenomenon or phenomena, And that's from the ancient Greek for appearance. I think we talked briefly, very briefly, about Plato's cave, where we have our philosopher who's fettered in a cave, um, sees the shadows cast on the cave wall, and the people in the cave mistake these for the real things. But really, they are mere phenomena, mere appearance. Right. And then, of course, our philosopher breaks free of his chains, um, sees things as they really are, goes up into the world, and you know the rest of the story. Um, so what does it mean to say that our perceptions are just phenomena? Well, they're just ideas. On phenomenalism, what we perceive are not representations of objects that are out there, like mind independent, publicly accessible objects out there in the world. Rather, what we're seeing, what we're perceiving, are ideas, just ideas. Everything is mental on phenomenalism. So this is not a coffee cup. This is an idea of a coffee cup. There is no physical coffee cup. I know some of you have watched The Matrix. Remember the part, there is no spoon? That's like phenomenalism. So we're directly aware on phenomenalism of our own sensations, but objects out there in the world are nothing but sensations or ideas. So one advantage is that phenomenalism it gets us that directness that we want. We're directly aware of our own sensations, including this coffee cup, which is not caused by a coffee cup out there in the world. It's just an idea, a mental representation. That's all it is. No, there are a couple of different varieties of phenomenalism. One is factual, one is linguistic or sometimes analytic. Factual phenomenalism says that these objects, as I described a moment ago, are just sensations. So there's no mind-independent physical object here. This is just a mental representation. That's all it is, just an idea. So is this tree, right? So is the table I'm sitting at. Sometimes we call this subjective idealism. And this is the view that's due to Bishop George Berkeley, who we're going to talk about today. Then there's linguistic phenomenalism. Now, what linguistic phenomenalism says is that talking about things in the world like coffee cup, when I say coffee cup, what I'm actually talking about, what I'm actually referring to with the words coffee cup is not the object. Rather, I'm using it as a sort of shorthand for my sense data caused by the object. So that's why it's linguistic or analytic. I'm not making a claim about the world, but rather about what my words refer to. And on linguistic phenomenalism, when I say look at this coffee cup, I'm saying look at this sense data right here. Yeah, forget about the mind independent, publicly accessible object that may or may not exist. Don't worry about that. We're talking about the representation, the sense data, the idea. So they don't deny the existence of mind independent objects that are out there in the world. They just say what we're talking about is not the objects, but like our mental representations of them. And our words for the objects are actually a shorthand for the sense data. All right, looks like we've got some questions in the chat. Jaden says linguistic phenomenalism basically gives the power of perception entirely into the hands of humans, which I find to be a major flaw. We're really the only species with complex and dialectical conversations outside of sounds of barking. So, how do animals perceive anything without classification? Well, that's an interesting point. Yeah, like how do animals without language, what's their experience of the world like? Um, I guess you could say that while animals couldn't really have the linguistic part of this sort of phenomenalism, they still have the sensations, the mental representations. Maybe they just can't talk about them effectively. Um, Maybe they're forms of communication. Like animals don't have language, but they do have forms of communication. And maybe their forms of communication, we could say, are about um, are about the sense data. Like those monkeys that make certain alarm calls when different predators are about. Maybe there's one call for a bird, one call for snake, a different call for a chimpanzee, right? All of these are different threats, but there are different calls, different alarms for each of them. And we would say, if we were going to take a linguistic phenomenalist view, we would say that those calls are about the sense data, not the predators themselves, but the representations of the predators. Then again, I don't know. There's probably some thinkers who work on animal cognition that probably have a way better take on this than I do, right? But anyway, yeah, I do share your concern, right? Whenever we talk about language being central to something, then we've got this problem where it's like, well, hang on, we're not the only ones with minds. What about non-human animals? Like, for example, a little bit before lecture started, I was surrounded by geese. Um, the geese are just kind of wandering around, eating a lot of grass before they migrate south for the winter. I wonder what their experience is like. Um, Probably very different from mine, but I don't doubt that they have a mental life, right? It's just a very goose-like mental life, not a human-like one. Um, Khalid, I'm not sure what you mean by paradoxical. Yeah, and like Praneel says, maybe they have non-linguistic analytic facilities like this or faculties. Like they still, I think animals still have some kind of what we could call folk reasoning abilities. They just don't do it linguistically, right? Yeah, like animals, yeah, might see. It's kind of like if you're really curious about this is related to something called the problem of subjectivity, which it's unfortunate that Crumley doesn't really have a chapter on consciousness. The final chapter of a lot of philosophy of mind books is usually a chapter on subjective consciousness. Crumley hasn't done that. Crumley's got a chapter on whether God exists, which I suppose is the other big question. But the big question in philosophy that interests me is how does subjective conscious experience work? Now, sorry, there's a fire alarm going off. It's a little bit distracting. Um, now, one of the problems of understanding how it works is something called the problem of subjectivity, which was highlighted very nicely in Thomas Nagel's paper entitled "What is it like to be a bat?" And I encourage all of you to check that paper out if you're interested in consciousness or animal cognition or anything like that. Yes, geese categorized to eat, yeah, eat and hiss or honk. Everybody's leave. Oh, we're about to be surrounded by humans now because the fire alarm is going off. I hope that doesn't interfere with the class that I have after this one. All right, well, let's move on. So, Berkeley's, or Barclay, I should say, it's spelled Berkeley, but it's actually pronounced Barclay. So, Barclay's factual phenomenalism. Before that, Nicholas, go ahead, please.
Actually, this might be covered in this slide, but I was going to ask, you said linguistic phenomenalism does not necessarily deny the existence of a mind-independent reality. Does factual phenomenalism?
It does, yes, it does. It says there are no physical objects, only ideas. That's why I mentioned, so, right, like I know some of you watched The Matrix upon my recommendation. For those of you who did, do you remember the part where Neo is visiting the Oracle? And we see all of these candidates who might be the one. Some of them are like moving things with their mind. One of them is bending spoons, right? And Neo can't figure out how this is happening, and the kid says to him, "You can't bend the spoon, right? That's impossible. You have to realize the truth, and that is that there is no spoon." And that's kind of like what this is. There's only representations. There aren't any objects, right? And he argued this in a couple of places, right? He argued for factual phenomenalism in a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, and then in the dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. Um, as mentioned, we also call this subjective idealism. This is kind of what motivated him. Pick an object. Pick an object, any object. Let's go with the coffee cup. Now, what happens if we take away all of the coffee cup's sensible properties? One by one, we take away the color. So, okay, it's no longer white. It no longer has color. It no longer has green, brown. It no longer has its shape. We take the shape away. We take away the other physical sensations that the coffee cup would cause one by one. We take every one of them away. What is left? Nothing is left. And Berkeley thought that we only understand objects via their sensible properties. So if you take it all away, there's nothing left. And as we'll see next time, or actually no, not next time, when we get back, when we talk about things, this is kind of like what Locke has to say about substance. But Locke says once you take all the properties away, you actually are left with something, and that is substance, something that can exist independently. But what is it? We know not what, he would say. Berkeley says, no, once you take all of the sensible properties away, what you have is nothing. So, how Yusuf asks, how or why did we end up with these specific perceptions of things? Well, we'll get to that. Berkeley has an interesting answer for that. Basically, it's God. Uh, if you have a problem in philosophy, you know, in the 17th, 18th century, you use God to solve it. Um, Sean says, and if we can define it like this, what is the most perfect well, there wouldn't. I mean, that's a very Platonic way of looking at it, right? But Berkeley isn't doing that. Um, this is what he actually says in his treatise. It seems no less evident that the various sensations or ideas imprinted on the senses cannot exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving them. The table I write on, I say exists, that is, I see and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I might perceive it, or that some other spirit actually does perceive it. Their esse is percipi, which is Latin. Esse is Latin for being, like to be, and percipi is to be perceived. So for Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. Their esse is percipi. Nor is it possible that they should have any existence out of the mind's thinking things which perceive them. Pretty nuts, right? So to be is to be perceived. If you're not being perceived, do you not exist? I don't mean you, because you are all perceiving individuals. But if no one were around to perceive the table that I'm sitting at or this tree behind me, would it cease to exist? That's kind of what it sounds like. Of course, again, that's a problem, and Berkeley solves it by appealing to God. So what's happening in the chat? Yeah, he does. Yeah, he goes full throttle into the mental, if you like. Yeah, object permanence mode. Except, yeah, what happens if there's nobody around to perceive anything? Well, don't worry about it. God's got it, basically. Like God is perceiving everything all the time. So God is like the guarantor of reality, even though nothing is actually real. It's all ideal, right? Here, when I say that things aren't real, I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm saying they exist as idea. So they really do exist, but they're not real because in philosophy, real means mind independent and publicly accessible, right? Yeah, kind of, Jaden. Yeah. I haven't read that story, but similar idea, right? Like we are all existing like in the mind of God for Berkeley. And it's not surprising he does this, right? Because he wasn't just a philosopher, he was also a bishop. So, boy, that fire alarm's still going. Okay, so how do we then distinguish between waking experience and dreams, right? This was a big deal for Descartes. Uh Khalid says, so is Berkeley arguing that things only occur when we are there to perceive them? Well, they would, but God perceives everything all the time, right? So that is why, like as I was about to say, like how do we tell the difference between dreaming and waking perception? Berkeley says it's the regularity, the orderliness, the stability of waking experiences that distinguishes them, the real ones, and I'll use quotes because they're not real in the philosophical sense. Um, but it's the stability and orderliness that distinguishes between dreaming experiences and waking experiences. Why do waking experiences have the stability and orderliness? Well, because again, God perceives everything all the time. And God is also the author of cause and effect. So the cause for Berkeley, and maybe you want to think back to David Hume and the uniformity principle on this. Like Berkeley is trying to solve some of these problems. How do we make sense of cause and effect? David Hume did it one way by saying, well, really, we're just naturally inclined to think this way, even though we're not rationally justified in adhering to something like the uniformity principle. Berkeley would say, well, um, causes are signs of the effect, but causes and effects are ultimately due to God. The effect is not caused by the cause. The cause and the effect are both caused by God, if that makes sense. Because think about it, how could it be otherwise? Because there are no physical objects. There cannot be physical causation if there aren't any physical objects. Yeah, like it's reliable in the sense that like I could leave this table after this lecture, but when I come back on Thursday, the table should still be here. I mean, it might not be. Maybe it breaks and it needs to be removed, or maybe it gets replaced with a bigger table. But those are mundane reasons why there would still be a table. The table is not just going to pop out of existence because nobody's observing it, right? Um, in fact, God is observing it all the time. God is kind of like aware of everything all the time. Okay, so what if, unlike Berkeley, you don't believe in God? Or what if there just isn't a God to be around to perceive everything all of the time? How would it work in that case if we didn't have this guarantor of our perceptions of everything? Well, Berkeley actually entertains this possibility. And he has us think of a sentence like, the earth rotates. How can we be sure of the truth of that proposition? After all, in Berkeley's day, we understood that the earth rotated on its axis, but nobody had like directly observed it because obviously there was no space travel yet. So, how does that work? Well, if you can't take a rocket up into space because they don't exist yet. But if somebody were placed up high enough, in principle, they could observe the rotation of the Earth. So if there is no God, or if you just don't believe in God, you can always replace God with a possible human observer. Then again, there might be an infinite regress here. Why? Well, who observes the observer, right? Yeah, because God is supposed to be omniscient. But here, we've got an observer who's not omniscient, who's not all-knowing. So we need somebody to observe him. It seems like we need ultimately everybody observing everybody else, which doesn't really work, right? So that's Berkeley's factual phenomenalism. What do we think? Any factual phenomenalist sympathizers in the class? I think it's an interesting idea. And I think that, a lot of those tech bros who are like, what if we live in a simulation? Elon Musk and those people. I think if they were just, if they just worked at having like a modicum of philosophical literacy, we wouldn't hear them asking such silly questions. In other words, if they'd read people like Berkeley or Leibniz is another one, um, we wouldn't get these silly ideas like, "Whoa, what if we live in a simulation, man?" Um, I don't think we live in a simulation, and I do think there is a mind-independent, publicly accessible world out there. You don't have to agree with me. I'm just curious. What do we think? Well, it's still philosophy, Jaden, because remember, we're trying to be certain what we can know, and we're also trying to work out what the nature of perception is. Khalid, briefly is right. Yeah, that Leibniz, exactly. Yeah, Leibniz co-discovered calculus. Um, in fact, the system of notation that we actually use, I believe, is Leibniz's. Um, So he and Isaac Newton kind of independently came up with it. But Leibniz was also a philosopher who thought that everything was made out of these monads, which are like little, almost like atomic bits of substance. And interestingly, he thought that there is no cause and effect. It's all pre-established harmony. So Leibniz is a very interesting thinker to read. If you've heard of him, like if you're an engineering student and you're doing a bunch of calculus and stuff, and you're like, oh, Leibniz, calculus, yes. Well, you should also go and read his philosophy because it's very interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, I say this more in my other class, my first year seminar, Minds and Machines, but I shouldn't neglect saying it here. Although I have said it here mostly when we were talking about Descartes. But remember that this is a time when philosophers and scientists were really very much the same thing. There wasn't really a difference yet. That's a difference that emerges later. Um, in like maybe the late 18th, 19th century, definitely by the 20th century, we've got this clear distinction between science and philosophy that wasn't really there in the 17th century or the early 18th. Yes, exactly. Like Isaac Newton. If you went back in time and asked Isaac Newton what his profession was, he would have told you he was a natural philosopher, not a scientist, right? So that's a good example. Okay. So that's Berkeley's factual phenomenalism. What about linguistic phenomenalism? Remember that linguistic phenomenalism is the idea that when we refer to the objects in the world, what we're actually doing is referring to the sensations of those objects, not the objects themselves. So if I look across the way and I point to that goose over there who's sneakily eating the grass by that tree stump, I don't like the way he's looking at me. But anyway, when I refer to that goose, I'm saying, hey, look at that goose. What I'm actually referring to is my sensation of the goose, my visual impression of the goose, my mental representation, not the goose itself. So these sentences that refer to objects translate these sentences that refer to sensations. You can think of it that way. So when I say that goose, linguistically, I'm saying there's an object, namely a goose, but I'm not actually referring to the goose. I'm referring to my mental representation of the goose. And this is kind of motivated by the idea of reduction, which we get from the sciences. The idea behind reduction is that we can reduce things to a more fundamental level of explanation without losing any meaning. So I can reduce the notion of heat to the mean kinetic energy of molecules, right? I can say like this coffee is hot, but a more reductive explanation would be that these coffee molecules have lots of kinetic energy and they're moving around a lot. So that's the idea there. Um, well, I don't know if it justifies us having it. I mean, we just have, most of us just have imaginations, right? But it does give us a way of talking about imaginary things versus real things. Interestingly, though, not everybody can do this, right? There is an interesting what should we call it? An interesting phenomenon called aphantasia, and this exists, kind of on a spectrum. But aphantasiacs don't really have. They might not have any mental imagery, or they might have very little. They might not have an inner monologue, right? Um, so there are people that do have a sort of lack of mental imagery, a lack of imagination in that sense. Um, yeah, Sean, like maybe this is just what language is like, right? Um, oh, okay, Jaden has aphantasia. Yeah, so you know what I mean. Um, well, Khalid asks, would we run into trouble with it because of the structure of our language and the limit? Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's really beyond the scope of what I can say here. But I think there are a lot of people that would say yes. Um, but I'm not really qualified to say much more. Okay, so Levon says, do these theories take into account that mental representations may vary from person to person? Yeah, I think so. I think that's something that they kind of allow consideration for. Um, so maybe there is still a sort of skeptical worry there. I maybe when I look at the goose and you look at it from a different perspective, our mental representations are going to be somewhat different, but they're close enough that we can say like, oh, we're actually talking about probably the same goose, but I'm referring using the shorthand to my mental representation of the goose and you to yours, right? Oh, you think visually, Jade? Okay, that's not exactly I mean, so you lack the monologue, but you still have mental imagery. Interesting. That's a little bit different, but still very interesting. Um, Galen, that sounds like aphantasia. Yeah, interesting. Like I said, it exists on a sort of spectrum. So some people have very rich mental imagery and an inner monologue. I'm somewhere around there. Some people might have no mental imagery at all, maybe no inner monologue, but uh, it comes in degrees. So yeah, very interesting. Now, how is linguistic phenomenalism really supposed to work, though? We don't really have any procedure for translating our talk of objects into sensations. Um, if I try and do that, things get pretty weird, right? Like if I say, look at that goose over there, can I really translate that into a sentence like, look over there so that you have a similar representation of the goose as I do when I look over there? I don't know. It seems a bit weird. And these sentences that describe the sentences that describe sensations don't imply the existence of physical objects, which is kind of interesting, right? Because the linguistic phenomenalists don't want to deny that there are physical objects, but the problem that they're faced with is that this shorthand that they're using, where when we refer to an object, we're actually referring to sensations. That, on the other hand, does not imply. There's nothing that necessarily implies the existence of anything external to us. So that could be a worry. That could be a skeptical challenge, right? Um, yeah, so not exactly mental imagery, I guess could be that, Khalid. Although I don't really think true photographic memories exist. That's just not how memory works. That's not to say there aren't people with incredible memories, but it's not like scanning a mental picture. Um, yeah, for remember what you heard. I have that. Yeah, that's my memory. And the weird thing is about that is eidetic comes from eidos, which is Greek. It doesn't mean what you've heard, but rather what is seen. Yeah, I think people use photographic memory as a shorthand for people who have really good memories. But even people with like the best memories, it's not like scanning a mental photograph. Although the weird thing is with my memory, I can replay things I've heard, which is weird. That's the kind of thing I can do that. It's weird. I've always been like that. Uh, so yeah, it probably depends on, like Galen says, yeah, but it might depend from person to person. Um, so, but memory is fascinating, but we're getting just a teeny bit off topic. Although I think if you have questions about memory, you should put them in the Discord server. And by the way, I've been a little bit lax at answering questions in the server just because I've been so busy. So I really am going to try and get back on that through this week, and then I imagine that if you have any questions that I haven't answered, or if you have new questions um, that occur to you over reading week, um, then I will probably be able to get back to you much faster than usual. Okay, let's move on. So, what we've seen is that every one of these theories has kind of faced some problem or another. So, in the 20th century, some philosophers tried to revive some version of direct realism. One attempt is adverbial theory. So, this is kind of an interesting one. The idea behind adverbial theory is that we perceive objects by experiencing them in various ways. So our sensations aren't really the objects of awareness, nor is sense data. That's not what we're aware of. Our sensations themselves are ways of being aware of physical objects. So here, this is actually kind of, I think, closely related to like Alva Noe and Kevin O'Regan's theory of inactive perception, where, unlike Locke, who said that our ideas are controversial. They sort of happen to us. I mean, they do, but on an active perception, um, perception is an active process, not a passive process. When we perceive, we're like actively engaged with the world, exploiting what Noe and O'Regan call our sensory motor contingencies. So here, yeah, sensations are like our various ways of being aware of physical objects. This is how Crumley puts it, and I think what he says here can really help you kind of grasp it. If it sounds weird, maybe it'll sound less weird after this. He says on page 137, philosophers sometimes describe this adverbial view in this way. Julia sees a T-shirt that is chartreuse. She is thus appeared to chartreusely. Or Sam takes a bite of an apple, and he is appeared to sweetly. Adverbial theory gives us a way of talking about how we sense and the subsequent belief that arises from sensation. So, sensations are ways of perceiving, but not themselves objects of perception. Now, perception here is direct, but this is also a causal theory. I don't know, what do you think? Does this make sense to you? Like when I knock on the trunk of this tree, I'm appeared to um solidly, right? The tree has appeared to me in a certain way, or is appearing to me in a certain way. Um, so like the feel of the tree trunk isn't an object of perception. It's the way that I perceive the tree trunk. It's not an object that causes something in me. It's a way I like actively engage with the world. But it's not meant to be representative. Yeah, that's fine. There are very subtle distinctions, but this is meant to be direct. Why is it direct? Because the sensations are not the objects of perception. There are a way of perceiving. So this is not, when I feel the tree trunk, it's not a mental representation, that I have direct contact with here. Rather, it is the way that I go about perceiving the tree, like as an active, like as an act. Yeah, Pernille, that's fair. But semantic, remember, semantic means meaning. So yeah, this is important. We're not just splitting hairs, right? We're trying to work out what is actually going on. Is perception um uh am I like aware of mental representations, or am I aware of the things themselves? I do actually I think this is kind of interesting, but it is also a little too direct for me. Then there's the doxastic view. This is from doxa, which means belief or opinion. Um, on the doxastic view, perception is not really about producing sensory experiences. Perception is a means of conveying information, like mental states. Mental states, remember, have content, right? Beliefs, for example, have this property of intentionality. They're about things. All mental states are like this. So, perception is really just a way of acquiring information or conveying information. David Armstrong describes it this way. He says that perception is a means of acquiring belief. Now, what this does is de-emphasize the sensory qualities, the phenomenology, what it's like. It de-emphasizes all of that, and it rather emphasizes or shifts the emphasis to information conveyance, or these information processes that generate beliefs. So the experiential character is less important, and importantly doesn't determine the content of our beliefs. This is also a kind of direct realist view. It's causal, but it's not really about what it's like, which to me, I don't know. I mean, that's a big part of perception is trying to account for the what it's like aspect of it, right? It's actually, I think it's really funny that, yeah, that we don't have a chapter on consciousness and we don't have a mention of Thomas Nagel's bats. Very weird when I think about it. But maybe that'll be some good extra reading that you can do over reading week if you're so inclined. Or I did say that I was going to provide a list of essay topics, and one of them will probably be about consciousness, where if you want to, you could go and read that paper. I would love to write my own textbook, Sean. The problem is I'm so darn busy teaching all the time that I don't have time to write anything. That's the curse. The curse of being a busy teacher. Um, and I'm not complaining about it. I'm not complaining about it at all. But yeah, if I was teaching maybe like one less course, I think I'd probably be working on a book of some kind. But I just don't have the time. But I don't know. I'll keep you all posted. Maybe I will write something. An alternative, and this is what my very first teaching assistant assignment here. I remember very clearly I was working for Professor Melissa Frankel, who was teaching this class, by the way. It was Mind, World, and Knowledge. But the way Professor Frankel did it is that she had a course pack where she chose just it wasn't a textbook. It was just primary sources. And I've often thought like maybe I'll give that a try because then I can kind of pick and choose what I want. So I might take a page from Professor Frankel one of these days from her book or from her course pack. Not literally, but maybe I'll take a page out of her book and maybe put my own course pack together. That might help. But I can but do read Thomas Nagel's paper. It's very famous. Um, Nicholas, go ahead.
Could you quickly re-explain the difference between um, producing sensory experience and conveying information? I don't think I'm quite understanding this distinction or what this
Yeah.
doxastic view is trying to get at.
So So up until now, all of the theories we've talked about have been focused on explaining what causes us to have perceptions and also interested in whether those perceptions resemble the objects or whatever causes them, right? But the doxastic view is less interested in that and more interested in the informational side of things. So whereas Locke was like, look at that tree. I mean, he didn't say this, but if Locke was like, look at that tree over there, I'm having an idea of that tree, a representation of the tree. It's caused by the tree, but does my idea actually resemble the thing itself? I don't know, you know? And then Barclay says, well, that tree is not, the perception is not caused by an object, it's just an idea, which is ultimately caused by God. So there's no worry about whether it resembles the tree or not, because there is no tree. It's just an idea. But Armstrong is saying, hey, this is not why what we're trying to explain. What we're trying to explain is the informational side of things. Like, who cares about what the tree is like? What's important to know is that the tree is over there so that you don't run into it. What's really important to know is you can have beliefs about trees. Trees are plants and they grow and they photosynthesize. We don't care if our mental representations of the trees represent the trees themselves. Um, Rather, what we want is perceptions that allow us to form accurate beliefs about trees. Does that make sense to you?
So then could we simultaneously hold both of these positions? Like, could I be a factual phenomenalist who also hold the doxastic view because they're aiming at different sort of goals?
I think you could merge elements of the two together. I don't know if whether you could entertain both. Like, I don't know enough about each theory to really tell you whether you could hold both of them at the same time. But I think you could probably pick and choose elements from each one, where you say like, okay, yeah, my perception talk, my representation talk is really it's a shorthand um, for mental states, not for objects in the world. But at the same time, I also, yeah, you have beliefs about those objects. I mean, yeah, I don't see why you couldn't synthesize the views somehow. But again, I'm not an expert on either one, so, take what I say with a grain of salt. But yeah. I mean, I guess the take home is like I say here on the third point from the bottom, the experiential character is not what's important here for the doxastic view. Um, it's the doxastic stuff, right? The stuff that has to do with belief formation. I mean, all of this really has a lot to do with the phenomenology, right? And what I mean by phenomenology is the subjective character of mental life. And Armstrong is less interested in that. It seems like he's more interested in the epistemic stuff, acquiring true beliefs. He wants a theory of perception that explains how perception allows us to acquire true beliefs, not a theory of perception that explains whether our mental representations of things are actually like the things themselves. Um, his view is direct. His view is causal. Why is it causal? Well, the idea is that perceptions cause us to acquire beliefs. Um, but then again, there are illusions. Our experience, whether set aside the question of how we form our beliefs, our experience does seem phenomenally rich. Our experience is qualia laden. I used the term phenomenology a while ago. Another term you're going to hear a lot, especially if you take my first year seminar on consciousness next term, you're going to hear this term qualia. Qualia, well, quale, singular, qualia, plural. These are the subjective first person, kind of like ineffable elements of conscious experience. So the bitter taste of coffee, like this taste of coffee, this bitter blonde roast from Starbucks where I put some cream and like one pack of sugar. It's kind of cold now. That's a quale. The blue of the sky. I look up, there's barely any clouds. There's some lovely like cirrus clouds up there. The moon is out. It looks like we've got a waning almost like just past half. I guess it's not a waning gibbous, but like a waning crescent moon in the sky and it's pretty. Those are qualia. The blue of my space backpack is a quale, right? They're all quale. And our experience is qualia laden. And yeah, I mean, I don't mean to deny that perceptual experiences play a role in forming beliefs. I mean, that seems obvious. But um, how can we overlook the problem of explaining the phenomenal character of our experiences? In fact, this is one of the biggest problems in philosophy, and it probably will remain so for some time, the problem of consciousness, or what David Chalmers calls the hard problem, explaining the subjective phenomenal qualitative character of experience, that is just about one of the most difficult problems that we've faced with. Daniel Dennett called it in his book Consciousness Explained. He called conscious experience the last surviving mystery. It really is that mysterious. It's up there with like the origins of the universe, if you ask me. Well, qualia are the what it's like to experience. Like Armstrong is concerned with propositional knowledge, and what I'm talking about now are like things like, like when I look at the leaves on this tree, they're green. Why are they green and not some other color? Why is green green? Why is green the way it is and blue is the way it is, right? We will talk about this further though when we get to the mind. We're not going to go super into consciousness in this course, but we are going to talk a bit about it. Look at that. We're actually done early. Um, no, well, what to do? What to do for the rest of the class? I don't know. Well, does anyone have any questions? I see people are already leaving. As soon as I hit that next time slide, the number starts to drop precipitously. Lisa, go ahead.
So I'm having trouble picking a topic for my essay.
hmm
How do I pick one?
well, first of all, I would say stay tuned for the list of topics, because
Okay,
I'm gonna try and come up with between 5 to 10 like little prompts that could help you come up with a topic.
okay,
Another thing I would say is like if there's something that you're interested in that's really caught your attention, and that you keep like coming back to think about, that's something to think about writing an essay on because it makes
okay.
it makes makes the work easier, right? If you're interested
hmm
in it. Is there something like that you've been thinking of doing?
Well, yeah, I don't know if you remember in the first quiz you gave us, there's something about dream states. I think it was Descartes that read it, I think
Yeah,
it was Rene. Yeah,
yeah,
and it was part of it was something that I was interested in, and I read about it, but I don't know if it's like a topic I can write on
yeah.
since it
Well,
wasn't.
uh, yeah, like you could write about just maybe the nature of dreams as mental phenomena.
Okay,
That's one possibility. You could talk about dream skepticism. Like one thing would be like maybe lay out the dream argument and how Descartes solves this skeptical worry. But then you could also talk about how other philosophers have solved it. Like for example, today we saw that Berkeley has something interesting to say about the dream, about or could respond to the dream argument with his own sort of framework of how perception works. So you could do something like that. You could say like, okay, here's what Descartes has to say, but here's how other thinkers might respond to what he has to say, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a
yeah.
possibility as well.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. And again, stay tuned for the other topics. I'm going to basically follow the chapters in the book. So we're going to have
Okay.
like we'll start with skepticism. Maybe you want to write an essay on skepticism and why, like whether a particular skeptical argument succeeds or fails. Then we'll talk about knowledge, and you can, maybe we'll talk about some epistemological theories. You can write a paper of like on foundationalism versus coherentism or something, right? Um,
Yeah.
we're gonna stick quite close to the textbook, but yeah,
Good to know.
yeah, no problem. Now Claire says, would I be able to post a link? Yeah, I'll try and find the paper, and share it. Or if somebody beats me to it, then yeah, then someone else can share it. Up to you. Is the proposal an essay? No, the proposal is just a proposal. So if you haven't seen the instructions on this, you should go and watch that lecture because it's all answered there. All of these questions are answered in that lecture. Does the quiz 2 contain chapter 7? I think so. Yeah. So well, what chapter did we just finish? Oh, now we're doing 6, 7 memes. Oh, I feel old. I don't know what that means. Um, yes, it will. So just like last time, I'm going to recommend that you don't start the quiz until that lecture is done. Because we'll finish chapter 7 on Tuesday, I think. You know what? So Hyla, ask me this in the Discord server, and I'll get back to you. Okay? Yeah, that's what I thought. Like it's just a nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. But then Devlin says, "Holy Christ!" and now it sounds like it means something serious. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what these kids are on about these days. Oh, reference to a bad song. Interesting. Okay, well, are there any other questions about anything? So I'll get back to everybody about the modern day 21. I don't even remember the 21 from the days of yore. Um, I, guys, I'm old. I'm getting old. Are there any other questions though? Uh, because if they're not, I don't see any point in keeping you. Would it be a bad idea to pick a topic which is debated for a long time with no good answer? Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, because remember the purpose of the essay. I mean, look, you're not going to solve any of these long-standing sort of perennial philosophical questions, or maybe you will if you're a genius or something, um but no, the purpose of the paper is for you to show me what you're really interested in and what you've learned, how to apply what you've learned, show me that you can reason. So yeah, you could do like rationalism versus empiricism. You could totally do that. Or you could compare various empiricist arguments to other empiricist arguments. Oh yeah, Khalid, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You want to do like I said, person A says this, person B says this, I say this, right? You want it to be kind of like dialectical. Yeah. And I'm going to keep a sort of open door like policy over reading week. I probably won't be on campus, but I'll be on the Discord server a bit more, and of course I'll be checking my email every day. So, if you run into any questions or concerns, do reach out. If it's anything like super important, like official business, like if you need an extension on something, email me. But if it's a question that you think everyone would benefit from an answer to, then put it on the Discord server. Um, okay, so next time we're going to start the first half of the chapter. Okay, so yeah. Is chapter 6? Is that the next chapter? Or is it 7? Whatever chapter the one on universals is. So this is again related to Sohaila's question. I'll get back to you because I don't know. It is 6. Okay, so it'll just be chapter 6. No chapter 7. Oh. Okay, everybody. I think that's it. So I'll see you all on Thursday. We'll start talking about universals. Have a good rest of your day. All right. Take it easy, everyone. Bye bye.